Ladies, gentlemen, and Harajam of all ages, it's been a hell of a day for the Diablo 4 player base and even the larger community surrounding the game that isn't even actively playing right now too, as we've come through the release of the actual Abattoir of Zir activity last night, along with patch 1.2.3 and some other things going down within that too. But the main thing going on right now is of course the Abattoir's release itself, so we'll quickly go over one major unintended change that happened with the patch and all the resulting aftermath of that still going on a little bit, and then honestly most of today will just be spent talking about Abattoir of Zir, talking about the requirements of actual progress, the reality of the reward, which is the Tears of Blood Glyph, and then quite simply just discussing what is going on in the community, the actual reaction to the new activity, and to this just growing pile of information about the glyph itself too. Starting off then, there was a pretty major bug as part of the Abattoir of Zir launch patch. One of the intended changes was to increase the glyph XP reward from higher tier nightmare dungeon completions to make them feel more rewarding and reduce the grind. But a strange interaction that happened in this patch when they did that was, while increasing the glyph XP rewards from Nightmare Dungeon, they also managed to increase the glyph XP required per level when upgrading a glyph, and when doing that they also rescaled everyone's glyph levels to match the new update level scaling with the same XP that they had before, meaning anyone who stopped at exactly level 15 on their glyphs for the radius increase now instantly has level 14 glyphs across the board. People with level 21 glyphs had them drop down to 19. The result is that we all just randomly lost a big chunk of power without even realizing it happened until you looked at your Paragon board yourself. And while the short-term solution to that is to simply get some glyph XP and patch the holes, this was obviously a terrible timing for this to happen. Hell, my first experience with Abattoir of Zir was just sort of starting the event thinking I would be more than tanky enough, having a really weird moment where I was lacking a bunch of damage and resource generation, and then I just sort of fell over like a stack of wet paper. And well, the main reason for that is I was missing nearly all secondary Paragon glyph bonuses because my glyphs were set to level 14, and I didn't realize that was a fact until after I died. The power difference is very staggering when that happens. While a patch has been released now to fix this for PC, change the values back to what they were before and such, no big deal. It is going to take a little bit longer to get the change to consoles, which should happen later today, as this is an actual client patch requiring issue to fix, and that means that crossplay has been disabled until that happens too. This is quite the irritating bug to come across, but mostly just because of the unfortunate timing matching up with the release of the Abattoir of Zir, and a lot of people just getting punched in the face for not realizing that this even happened and not getting to even adjust to compensate, which honestly is just a little bit funny. Then we arrive at the big elephant in the room. What's the community sentiment and reaction to the release of the Abattoir of Zir itself and the early experience that we've all been having with it? Well, I'd say about 95% of players simply are saying this thing is bullshit, and there are a whole variety of reasons why. The first one that I want to focus in on is the most ridiculous part of it in my opinion, which is the Tears of Blood Glyph. This thing is really strong. It's supposed to be our reward for completing it, and it's supposed to grow with us as we progress through the tiers of the Abattoir of Zir itself, but the truth is, it requires a hell of a lot of investment. From level 1 to level 2, it requires 2,000 glyph XP, which isn't too bad. It's the equivalent of 2 tier 1 Abattoir completions, but then it jumps to 4,000, then 7,000, then 11,000, then 20,000 per single level, and what I realized very quickly is that the glyph's XP requirement to level scales exponentially upwards with every level you gain, and someone has done the math on this. Here's a fun thing to share. To get a glyph from level 49 to level 50, so one singular level, but a really important one, is around 275,000 glyph experience. 275,000! That is 275 tier 1 completions for that singular level, and that's the one before the radius increase, so it's a very relevant point of significant power increase, and a very relevant point that a lot of us thought we'd be getting to as fast as we could. And because that is just the singular level, it doesn't even include the massive amount that you need to even reach that point. Put simply, the glyph offers a lot of power. In theory, leveling it up offers a significant amount more, and each level is a nice little bump with even bigger milestones that are along the way. But at this current rate that it goes up, it will literally take hundreds of hours to grind to reach level 50 on this glyph. And considering its maximum level is 200, not even 50, 200, I absolutely shudder to imagine the cost of something like level 199 to 200 itself. That would be insane levels of farm, millions and millions of glyph XP if it keeps the same growth rate that it has right now. That is a lot of numbers and information, yeah, but to just sort of round it up in a simpler way, no average player, not a singular one, should expect to ever reach even level 50 on the Tears of Blood glyph in its current state, and that sucks because that is the radius increase, which is a huge jump, but it just will not be achievable for people who don't hard dedicate themselves to grinding this glyph XP all day, all night. It just won't happen. And that is a really big shame, because that really just sort of disincentivizes the majority of people from even trying to level this glyph in the first place, because we know what it will take. We know that there are limits that we probably just won't be able to surpass as a normal player, and that's just the glyph itself though. So, well, let's talk about the Abattoir itself as an activity as a whole. Tier 1 is fine, right? We all agree that is about what they said to expect, near the difficulty of a Tier 100 Nightmare Dungeon, but then the difficulty will scale an insane amount very quickly. Significant monster health and damage increases with every tier past 1. Exponential growth, sort of like the required glyph experience for the glyph itself. And the result is that most average players, even in near perfect builds, are getting walled around tier 5 to 8, with the only real exceptions, of course, being Barbarian and Sorcerer, who we knew would have the best chance, or just people who have every Uber Unique in the world. And even then, the Barbarians and the Sorcerers have been walled in the mid to high teens, with a tier 20 looking like an insane concept from where we are currently standing. The thing is, there was always this thought in the back of my mind that as long as we can get to a point where we are tanky enough to survive the hardest tiers, then the only thing we really need to do is pump levels into the tiers of Blood Glyph. It would only be a matter of time, right? As it's something that just continues upwardly scaling our damage multiplicatively in ways that other things don't. It can make up for the holes that are created by replacing offensive gear with defensive gear, and so long as you can survive, the glyph could have done the required carrying for your offense. Instead, because the glyph has such insane farm requirements, it will be just a very select few people who ever even see it at higher levels as a result. And so here is what we are left with, really. An activity that is intentionally created to be the most difficult thing we've ever had in the game, and it is, but it also just highlights a lot, and I mean a lot of issues that people just have with the combat philosophy of the game in general. Most times in this game, and especially in the Abattoir of Zir, there are two sides of limits that you will reach. One is getting one-shot. If you are one-shot by an enemy, that is a clear sign that you need to be tankier. The only thing is, there are people who are going as hard on into damage reduction as they physically can, and still getting one-shot, even in tier 8, tier 10, and that in itself shows a massive imbalance in the classes that, while we all were aware of, is now just on full display in a measurable manner. Things like how Rogue does have more movement than any other class and is squishier as a result, and that's sort of the way the class was built, but in reality that doesn't even matter, because everyone is expected to avoid the telegraphed mechanics no matter what. It doesn't make a difference. It just makes Rogue squishier for the unavoidable parts of damage. As a result, so many people are being one-shot in so many different ways, and that itself is causing a ton of irritation, because dying to one-shots is dying in a way that you cannot easily fix. But then we have the other side of it, with people who over-tanked, over-turtled, and are timing out on even a tier 3 or 4 as a result. And if you're not timing out, you might even just be dying to the Blood Seekers at the end because you run out of potions, because you're just fighting them for so long because your damage isn't high enough. So let's get this part straight. No one is expecting anyone to do a tier 25 on night 1 with no effort, especially not with the devs saying it would be impossible to ever complete. But in order to fix the two issues that I just mentioned, the only real thing that you can do is sort of slight swaps. Gear swaps, skill changes, Paragon board shuffling, and that brings us back to a major failing of the game, which is just how hard it is to swap equipment, swap builds, how hard it is to make secondary pieces of gear worth using, the cost of upgrading, of enchanting, the rarity of good pieces, the actual time investment to make this happen too, and how some aspects just rarely show up, if ever. The irritating nature of changing your Paragon and skill points as well, and the strangely high cost of doing so too. So it highlights so many other parts of this problem area of the game, which is actually changing builds, or even changing parts of your build. For the most part though, the sentiment that I'm seeing people say is that Abattoir of Zir just sort of doesn't feel fun. It feels like a statistical wall, a challenge that is checking what your gear is, not checking what you are as a player. There's minimal player input on your actual success, really, where skill might be the difference between completing a tier 9 and a tier 10, maybe even a tier 11, but skill won't buy you much more than that. It won't buy you more than a couple of tiers, because everything else is entirely 100% dependent on how you have put your gear, your skills, your Paragon points, and your vampiric powers together. The result is something that feels incredibly statistical and yet punishing. It feels like sticking your build into a spreadsheet and seeing how it works. There are tons of builds who have more than enough damage and tankiness to get through the dungeon clearing part of the Abattoir though, but then get immediately walled by the Blood Seekers at the end, as these are the real test. And to this, I think that is just a bit of poor balancing from the developers. I can understand wanting to have the end portion, the actual sort of boss, being a bit of a spike, but to me, generally speaking, the ideal balance of this activity would be to make the wave clear feel relatively even to the final enemies as well, at least on average. But part of this imbalance is due to the other major problem that people are latching onto here, which is the randomness of the combat in this whole thing. The shrines can pop up and they are random. Their locations are random, the quantity of them are random, the buffs are random, and they make a really big difference if you get the right ones in the right places at the right times. The enemy types that spawn in your abattoir are randomly selected when you pop the sigil, and the difficulty difference between the monster families that are snakes or spiders with their massive poison damage that they deal and their explosions when they die, the skeletons with their ridiculous one-shot bone ballistas, and something like, oh, you know, just goat men. Who cares? They're just sort of goat men. They just walk around. Yes, they have jump attacks, but they're so much easier as a general concept than the other monster families, and it really shows here. A tier 8 with a good monster family RNG can be easier than a tier 5 with bad monster family RNG, and that's not even bringing up the other elephant in the room too, which is elite enemy affixes. The randomness of these can make or break a run as well, and that's just talking about normal elites, not to mention when you reach the end and spawn into Bloodseekers, who essentially are just super powerful elites in comparison to anything else in the dungeon, and have even more different affixes. They have multiple affixes, and 3 of them spawn in at the same time, and that means that you just get a good smattering of all the affixes in the game. You get a bunch of random ones, but you generally get a good selection of them, and this suddenly highlights another major problem. The first is suppressors, or wall elites. These just completely end runs for builds with projectiles. You can be absolutely breezing through the abattoir and then hit the end bosses, which you could normally decimate, but if your build uses projectiles, then a suppressor would just completely end your run, especially if there is also an enemy that explodes, because then you have the overlap of these affixes too, where you have to stand inside of the suppressor bubble to actually be able to do any damage, but on top of the exploding enemy who is doing ridiculous amounts of damage to you. It's just a nightmare. The other big problem affix is Vampiric, the lifesteal elite affix, which is an especially large problem within this activity. When a player reaches the limit of what they can push, it means that they have hit that perfect harmony of putting on just enough tankiness to survive without sacrificing so much damage that they can't beat the timer. And the one thing that really fucks up a build that is on the edge like that is the Vampiric affix on a Bloodseeker elite at the end. It means that you won't have the damage to just obliterate it between its healing frequency, but it also means that you won't die to its just normal attacks. And this creates a real stalemate that forces an end condition to the abattoir just almost immediately. It pretty much just ruins your run. It sucks, it feels terrible, and this is part of the video where I mentioned something very important to genuinely take to heart. The developers made this activity as a test run for future ultra endgame activities for Diablo 4. There are a lot of problems with it. There's some good, don't get me wrong, there are parts of it I enjoy, but there's some very glaring issues, and it points out problems with RNG, and maybe they should have cut down on the randomness for this activity as a result, but some people have more issues with it than me, some people have less. But the developers have stated themselves, this is a test, it's an experiment for the future, and something that they want our feedback on. So this is our moment to give them that feedback. Tell them what you like, tell them what you don't, tell them what you feel about the event as a whole, but more importantly, tell them why. Our job as players is not to fix the game. We don't need to come up with the solutions, but our job is to be vocal about what the problems are so the developers know what needs fixing. And I think if there is one thing we can agree on as a player base, it's that there are multiple aspects of this that they have pointed out that needs fixing before any future endgame activities of this kind are made again in the future for Diablo 4. Hopefully over the coming weeks, as players just sort of no-life farm the tiers of Blood Glyph, we will get some exciting moments of good players reaching crazy milestones, and of course, we will talk about those when they happen. But as it stands, I'm just very of two minds on this activity as a whole. I really liked the concept, but the execution, the way it feels to actively engage with, and the sort of disappointment of the reward in the glyph requiring such an insane amount of farm that most people won't see it in a cool place. The execution of all of this just feels a bit lacking. That's it then, everyone. Just a roundup of the way things have been going with the 1.2.3 update, the accidental mistake that is now fixed on PC with the Glyph XP but is still in the works for consoles, the issues with the Tears of Blood Glyph itself, and then of course the community reaction and sentiment about the Abattoir of Zir itself, and a lot of the issues that I've noticed myself with it. I hope you've enjoyed this breakdown of current happenings, and of course, let me know your own thoughts on all of this in the comments down below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.